Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight at the Palisades Historical Society for this very special program. I'm Anthea Raymond. I grew up in the Palisades, and I went to Pali High and have returned to help my friend Eric Dugdale do some programming at the Historical Society. And this is a program I'm especially excited about because it also involves a very good friend of mine, Bettina Boxall, who I've known for a long time as a colleague and friend in the journalistic profession. She's going to tell us more about what's going to happen next and tell us about our very esteemed guest speaker who will be telling you about wildfires. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that we are a nonprofit. This is we rely on memberships and also donations to bring you programs like this, and this has been a very good program for us. We've had a lot of new members and some unsolicited donations come on in. But if you see what you or enjoy what you are about to hear tonight and think it's important to keep programs like this going, I hope you'll consider joining us as a member, renewing, or maybe making a donation if you haven't already. So thank you again for coming, and just thank you to the folks from the Topanga Historical Society who are helping us document the event, to Eric Dugdale and all my colleagues on the Palisades Historical Society board for making this program happen. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bettina Boxall from the Los Angeles Times.
Good evening, everyone. So I am a reporter with the Los Angeles Times. I'm in my 33rd year with the Los Angeles Times, which means that I have seen a lot of wildfires. I have been writing about wildfire off and on since 1993, when I experienced my first wildfire in the big fire that ran from San Fernando Valley to Malibu in an afternoon. And I will always remember that. So with me on the stage is Jon Keeley, who I first interviewed, I think probably in 2007. Jon is a research scientist with the United States Geological Survey. He's an adjunct professor of ecology at UCLA, and he is without dispute one of the foremost authorities on wildfire in California, particularly in Southern California and in the chaparral and coastal sagebrush ecosystems, which carpet the Santa Monica Mountains, in which we all live among. And so first, Jon is going to present a PowerPoint slideshow on the history of wildfire in the Santa Monica Mountains. And as you can imagine, it's a rather rich history. And then we are going to have a discussion. I'm going to play reporter and ask Jon questions. He is a prolific researcher. Has written an incredible number of peer-reviewed scientific papers, has a great presence in the scientific literature about wildfire in Southern California. I will go for a year or two without calling him up or interviewing him. Then I go back to his website and I look, and he's published another 2 or 3 papers. He's really a remarkably prolific researcher and working with other people who specialize in wildfire and the ecosystems of Southern California. So I give you Jon Keeley.
Thank you, Thea, for inviting me for this presentation and to be on the stage with Bettina Boxall. I've interacted with her over the years, and she is, without a doubt, one of the best reporters, and particularly when it comes to fires. I remember this story she did back in 2007, I guess it was, where she actually went to the field with me and wanted to learn about what was going on with fire issues, and wrote a long series, something like 6 different papers on this, 5, and won a Pulitzer Prize. Is that right for that? So she's certainly one of the best that we have in terms of reporting on fire issues. What I want to talk about is relatively brief because I want to have plenty of time to interact with Bettina. And so some of the subjects I'll go over will be kind of brief, but if you have questions, we're going to have time in the latter half of this evening for you to bring up questions. So just retain those questions. So tonight, Eric and I are doing this talk together. Eric is moving my slides forward, so go ahead, Eric. And we could turn those lights off the screen. Now, in terms of fire issues, the thing that has really captured people's attention is we're seeing a change in California in fire issues. Since the year 2000, there's been a doubling of the amount of area burned relative to the prior 2 decades, because this is something that's captured a lot of attention. It's particularly important in the Santa Monica Mountains because we have a lot of concerns in this part of the world. There are substantial natural resources, and so we're concerned about what is the impact of these fires on ecosystem recovery. I'll touch very briefly on that. There are also a great many significant historical resources. This was a really important Native American sites prior to European colonization. So we're going to talk, maybe not going back that far, but certainly the history of burning patterns in the Santa Monica. And then finally, increasing human developments happening at an incredible pace all over the state. And we need to understand how this is impacting fires and how fire is impacting development. Go ahead, Eric. Now, if you go into one of these sites, like after the Woolsey fire right after, it looks something like this. It looks like it's pretty much destroyed. And that's because the fires we have are naturally all high intensity, what we call crown fires. They burn everything right to the ground. Go ahead. But you go out in the first spring after the fire and it all greens up. It looks something like this. And so it has the ability to recover very rapidly under most conditions. Go ahead, Eric. They come back in a variety of ways. Some of these shrubs, like the common chamois shrub, resprouts from the very base of the shrub, as you can see there. Go ahead. But chamois also has seeds that it's produced over a period of decades or even longer, and those seeds sit dormant in the soil and they're stimulated to germinate by the fire. Another one? Another common shrub is California lilac or ceanothus. They too have seeds that sit in the soil. They wait till a fire comes, and then they're triggered to germinate by the fire. Next. And within like a couple years after the fire, most of these chaparral sites are starting well on their way to recovery. And so fire per se is not a problem for these ecosystems. Go ahead. One of the striking things about post-fire environments, though, in the Santa Monicas is we have a plethora of wildflowers that very often, go ahead, go back. We have a plethora of wildfire flowers that are seldom seen when their chaparral vegetation is intact. It's only after that shrubland has been burned off that we get this vast display of different wildflowers coming up. And that's an interesting story in our chaparral landscapes because most of these species have seeds that will lay dormant in the soil for as long as a century. They require smoke from the fire to trigger their germination, and there's been a lot of research in recent years on what it is in smoke. Certainly one of the components is nitrogen dioxide in smoke at very tiny amounts. 500 parts per million will trigger germination of many of these species. Indicates there's a long coevolutionary history between fire and these ecosystems. Go ahead, next. Just to summarize what we can say about the impact of these fires on chaparral shrublands, not only is chaparral adapted to these fires, but it's actually dependent. We think of it as a fire-dependent vegetation because they have seeds that simply won't germinate and recruit until there's a fire. So they have to have a fire in order to continue their life history. However, one of the important things about this adaptation of chaparral to fire is it's very sensitive to the interval between fires. Historically, we believe that in the Santa Monica Mountains, fires probably burned on the order of 30 to 130-year intervals, and the chaparral is very resilient to that frequency. However, today, humans are responsible for 99% of all our fires, and they've greatly increased that frequency. Go ahead. And what happens when you increase that frequency, So you have more than a fire every 30 years, but in this case, this is an area from Topanga Canyon. This is what the vegetation looks like when it's burned maybe at a normal frequency of every 30 years, dominated by evergreen shrubs. This is what happens when you get 3 fires in 12 years. Basically, most of the species are extirpated from the site. A few things like these laurel leaf sumac are capable of resprouting and persist, but mostly what you have is exotic grasslands. And these are not native species. They come in, and they have a lot of impact on our natural resources. Number one, they're not native, so it changes the conservation value of these landscapes. It goes from almost all native species to mostly all non-native species. It impacts the hydrology of the landscape. These shrubs are capable of holding water on those steep slopes much better than the shallow-rooted grasses. Has impacts on the fire regime too. This landscape here burns about every 6 months. This landscape here can burn any, it's only flammable about 6 months out of the year, whereas this landscape here is flammable 12 months out of the year. So a lot of changes happen when we increase fire frequency and cause the invasion of these non-native species. Go ahead, next. We also play a role in this invasion process. The Woolsey fire, when it occurred, there were a lot of fire breaks produced by bulldozers around the edge of the Woolsey fire to preserve homes. These areas are just prime areas for invasion of non-native species. So that's another issue that needs to be dealt with respect to fires and non-natives. Go ahead. Now, the Woolsey fire, of course, is the thing that captured most people's attention in recent years. Go ahead, next. But there are a number of interesting fires that have occurred in the Santa Monica that have captured a lot of attention. 1961, the Bel Air fire was noted because it burned through a landscape that had a lot of homes, and those homes had a lot of celebrities. And so there are quite a few Hollywood celebrities that got burned out of their house. Go ahead, next. Really?
Yeah. There's a picture of him with a hose in a suit.
Oh, interesting. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, look just like that. This was Vice President Richard Nixon at the time, who lived in Bel Air. And this is a classical picture. Eric remembers it very well. This has played in a lot of different venues. Go ahead, next. Now, one of the fires that is perhaps most interesting is the Santa Monica Mountains was the site in 1933 of a very small fire, 40 acres, but it's noted as being, up until 2018, it accounted for more deaths in a fire than any other fire in the past. There were 33 men that were killed fighting the fire. And this all came about because of the CCC program. They had all of these laborers working in Griffith Park doing various projects. Then an arson started a fire down here towards the edge of the mountains. And the CCE workers were forced to go fight that fire. In fact, that's historically was the case of how fires got fought, is in the past, before we had organized fire departments, anybody who happened to be around at the time of a fire was required by law to help fight those fires. Go ahead, next. Now, the one characteristic of our fires is they almost all, at least the big ones, are driven by this synoptic weather condition. By synoptic, we mean it's a condition set up over the region, including the Great Basin, where you get a high-pressure cell. And if you have a low-pressure cell off the coast, you get this pressure gradient that pushes air masses offshore. And this is a fire near Malibu. Here's Malibu here. And you can see that smoke plume moving out into the water. This is characteristic of most of our big fires in the state. Go ahead, next. These fires are driven by Santa Ana winds, and this bar graph here shows from January through December the distribution of these winds. They're predominantly in the autumn, and that's particularly dangerous. Go ahead, next. Because if you look at the climate in California, these bars here represent the rainy season, the dots represent the dry season. Those Santa Ana winds come at the end of our dry season. So it's the worst possible conditions for wildfires, and that's where we get the worst fires. Go ahead. Now, just go through this, Eric, sort of gradually to just describe. This is the 1993, I believe, Green Meadow fire. And what you see here is the time frame, and you see how the fire spread. So this is 12:30 in the afternoon. 2 hours later, it's almost doubled, more than doubled in size. Go ahead. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's probably 3 or 4 times the size it was earlier on. Keep going, just stream through this, just to get an idea of what happens in these Santa Ana-driven fires. They move extremely fast. And that's one of the reasons they're so deadly. For example, the wind-driven fire that consumed the town of Paradise, from the time it ignited to the time it hit Paradise, it was an hour and a half. So it moved extremely fast. And when these fires are moving so rapidly, it's the primary reason these are such a problem for humans. Go ahead, next. Now, one of the things that is important to realize is these fires we've had for a very long period of time. In fact, we have records of big fires in the Santa Monica Mountains going back to the 1880s, and almost certainly there were big ones before that. Here's Malibu here, Point Dume, and next slide will show what we've seen historically. Go ahead, Eric. This is something from the LA Times, a beautiful illustration of what we've seen about every 10 years in the Santa Monica Mountains, going back to the 20s. But 1935, we had the Malibu fire, 28,000 acres. 10 years later, 15,000 Woodland Hills fire. 1956, the Sherwood Zuma fire, 38,000 acres. And a number of other somewhat smaller fires. 1970, the Wright fire, 28,000 acres. You go up 10 years, 1982, the Dayton Canyon fire, 44,000 acres. The Green Meadow fire in 93, 38,000 acres. And later in the 90s, we had the Calabasas fire, and then ultimately here, the Woolsey fire. So we've had a long history of these fires. They're nothing new. All of these have been driven by these Santa Ana winds, and so that's the real trick in terms of understanding our fire situation, is how do we deal with these fires that are driven by these extreme winds for which we have no control over. Go ahead, next. Now, it's important, particularly in the discussion that Bettina and I will have, to recognize how unique Southern California is relative to much of the rest of the state, because a lot of what you hear in the media has to do with fires in other parts of California. So I'll just give you a very quick primer on how to think about fire throughout California. It's the southern part of the state. We have mostly shrublands, and we have a lot of people, about 10 times what you find in the northern part of the state, and much of that is forested. In terms of numbers of fires, 475 versus 4,700, about an order of magnitude more fires in this part of the state. And in terms of the cause, a good many of the fires in the north are started by lightning. They're natural lightning-ignited fires. Here, 99% of our fires are started by people. It's also been, it's important to realize that the management of California has varied from one part of the state to the next. The blue areas indicate national forests, and the blue indicates the extent to which those areas have missed fires in the last 100 years relative to what we think the historical frequency is or was. And the blues indicate there's a deficit. In other words, all our forests have been missing fires because we're really good at putting out fires in forests. We're not very good at putting out fires in the southern part of the state. We have no deficit. In fact, the yellows indicate an excess. We've had way more fire in the last 100 years than we believe historically was ever the case. Next. And one of the things that's reflected in this is the factors that drive these fires. In the northern part of the state, we have had a deficit of burning in the last 100 years. We've accumulated a lot of dangerous fuels. And so much of the landscape has not been burned in a very long time. And so there's a lot of dangerous fuels. And this diagram here shows a fire that occurred up in the northeastern part of the state in 2012. And the colored areas indicate previous fires. What you can see is most of that landscape had never burned since 1910. And so you have fires burning in landscapes that basically have missed fires for a century, and that's the primary problem with fires in the Sierra Nevada. We have a lot of dangerous fuels, and what it tells us is something along the lines of what we need to do to solve the fire problem in the Sierra Nevada forest, and it largely centers around fuel treatments. Next. But if you look at Southern California, this is the Woolsey fire. And the perimeter of the Woolsey fire goes all around like this, and it's hard to find any area in there that hasn't burned. And much of that area has burned repeatedly in the last 100 years. So Southern California doesn't have a problem with excess fuels. We're burning our landscape all the time. So very different landscape problems than in the Sierra Nevada. So when you hear someone talk about fire in the state, you need to make sure you pin them down. Are you talking about Sierra Nevada forest fires or Southern California wildfires? Go ahead. Now, here's just an illustration to kind of wrap this up that contrasts these fires in the Sierra Nevada, which we call fuel-dominated fires, versus wind-dominated fires. And the wind-dominated fires, we have lots of them historically. In Orange County, the Santiago fire of 1889, up until a couple years ago, was the largest fire in the state, over 300,000 acres in size. 1970, we had the big Laguna fire in San Diego, and then again the Cedar fire, the Witch fire, and a whole series of fires in the last decade. One of the things, though, to point out, because it's something that we need to discuss, and that is the causes of these fires. Most of our fires in the Sierras are started by lightning. They're natural lightning-ignited fires. In the last decade, all of our big fires have been started by power line failures. And so this is a major issue that we need to think a lot more about, is how do we deal with these power line failures? Go ahead, next. And this is just an illustration of this problem where we have power lines that are overhead fuels, and if anything fails, like one of those lines snaps during a powerful wind, you're very likely going to ignite a fire. Next. I'll just raise one other issue here because it might come up in discussion, and that is we need to understand we've had really severe fires in 2017, 2018 in the southern part of the state. And certainly part of the reason is we've had a really severe drought. We've had a drought that extended from 2012 to 2018. And that drought caused a huge amount of dieback. This is a scene taken a year and a half ago from the Santa Monica Mountains. And all that gray represents dead shrubs. And so we have a massive amount of dead vegetation on the landscape. And that's certainly a factor in accounting for these big fires. And it's an important thing to keep in mind because people are looking at these big fires from 2017, 2018 and saying, well, this is the new normal. This is what we should expect. But if they're the result of this anomalous drought effect, then going forward, we don't necessarily expect 6-year droughts like we had recently, and therefore we might not necessarily expect a repeat of 2017, 2018. And next. Oh, the last thing I'll just raise is the issue of population, because there's a lot of discussion today about how climate change and global warming is impacting our fires. And the climatologists will point out that since the year 2000, we've had a doubling amount of area burned, and we've also had a steady increase, well, maybe not steady, it's fluctuated, but we've had overall an increase in temperature. And so there's a lot of emphasis on the role of global warming in explaining why we have more and more fires. But one of the things that you need to keep in mind is our big fires, particularly in coastal California and like Santa Monica Mountains, are started by people. 100% of them are started by people. And people are increasing in frequency. So since the year 2000, we've had a doubling in area burned. We've also added 6 million more people to the state. And every year, we're adding 300,000 more people. Just take Ventura County, for example, where the Woolsey fire occurred. Just since 2000, we've added 100,000 people to Ventura County. So we're populating the landscape, and this has two potential impacts. One, it increases the probability that someone will start a fire during a Santa Ana wind condition. The more people, the more chances. And then also, because we're putting 300,000 people a year into the state, they're being forced out into, due to urban sprawl, forced out into landscapes that are very hazardous. And so maybe it's not a surprise that we're seeing increases in the number of people killed by fires in recent decades. We just have more people at risk. And I'll just end it there, and Bettina and I can then discuss these issues in more detail and solicit questions from the audience at some point.
Thank you. And I believe we're supposed to pull our chairs over a little bit. So thank you, John. You definitely set the framework for our discussion. And what since you touched on all the major points that I was thinking of, what I'd really like to do is to sort of expand on all of those. And first of all, you talked about how, chaparral regenerates with fire, and some seeds, lie dormant for, up to a century. But there's one. When wildfire in Southern California is discussed, particularly by firefighters, wildland firefighters, they frequently say, chaparral needs to burn, and it needs to burn frequently. But that's not exactly the case, is it?
No. There's no question. It does not need to burn frequently, and as I pointed out earlier, if it's burning at intervals less than every 30 years, it's potentially vulnerable for extirpation of certain species. So the chaparral does not need to burn frequently, and in fact is damaged when it burns too frequently. And it's one of the dilemmas we have in terms of managing fires in chaparral systems, particularly in a state that has a huge amount of forested landscape, because in forests, they have had historically a different type of fire regime. They've had historical fires that have burned low intensity in the understory, and now the managers want to go in and solve the fire problem, and they want to eliminate the fuel, so they burn frequently. That frequent burning is compatible both with reducing fire hazard and for resource protection, because the species are adapted to it. In chaparral, in order to reduce the fire hazard by prescription burning, you have to burn at a fairly short interval, and that is damaging to resources. And so that's one of the problems in trying to take solutions that work in the Sierra Nevada forest and apply them to our landscapes.
Yeah, I think a very important thing that most people don't realize is that, remember that California is a huge state. It has some of the greatest biodiversity in the entire country. And each of those ecoregions have different fire regimes. So there is not one recipe for, natural regime of fire in California. And what so often happens is that the media, firefighters, everybody takes this template for the Sierra Nevada, and actually just a certain mid-elevation Sierra Nevada, where the natural fire regime was to have frequent low-intensity fires that burned small young trees and kept a more open forest. And then they want to take that and then they want to put it on top of all the other ecosystems in California, and particularly in Southern California. And it is simply not a template that you can interchange like that. And another thing that we often hear from, speaking about the damage of frequent fires from every time there's a big fire, and the LA Times covers it, and we talk to the public information officers, they'll say, it hasn't burned here in 20 years, it hasn't burned here in 80 years, there's so much fuel, it's old, it's senescent, we're going to have a horrible wildfire. Now, you've done research that actually showed that you went back and looked at the wildfires in San Diego County in 2003 and 2007 and documented where the wind-driven fires burned right through an area that had burned just like 4 years before. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about this idea that way to prevent these really big out-of-control wildfires is to burn chaparral or to clear it, and there you will prevent these catastrophic wildfires.
Well, there's a lot there.
John, that's the way I ask questions.
Well, let me start at the beginning of what you raised, and that is the idea of whether chaparral, when it got old, was senescent and would create horrible wildfires. Those are really two very different issues. The senescence refers to the biology of the system, and we have no evidence that species become senescent in chaparral.
It doesn't mean that they're senile, it just means that they're old.
Yeah, I taught for 20 years, and I had a student one time ask me, what is a senescent, or I asked the class, what is a senescent chaparral shrub? And one student raised her hand and said, it's a shrub that forgets to close its stomatal pores. But there's no evidence that lack of fire, even for a century, causes any problems for the recovery of chaparral. It can burn after a century, and it still comes back very well. But it can't withstand frequent fires. So if the fires are, say, more than once a decade or once every 20 years, that can be problematical for them to recover. Now, when they get to be old, 80 years of age, that's not a problem for the chaparral, but it does result in particularly dangerous conditions in terms of wildfires. And so from a firefighter's perspective, that's something that they perhaps would want to avoid. In terms of coming up with things that are compatible with both resources and reducing fire hazard, we have a whole range of anything beyond 30 years is probably okay to burn and still the vegetation recovers. But the one thing to keep in mind is in Southern California, we don't have to worry about that problem. We don't have very many areas that go more than 30 years without a fire, and so it's very seldom that we find areas that go a long time without a fire because people are, adding to the fire situation.
Well, and also, if you look at the wind-driven fires that are our most destructive fires and are the biggest problem, they burn right through areas that have burned, fairly recently. They jump fuel breaks. I did a big story this past year looking at the state's program of creating. So after the Camp Fire, Governor Newsom came out with this. And CAL FIRE came out with this program of, well, we have to have these fuel clearance projects all over the state, and there was like $32 million was spent on it, this past year, and they were, creating, what they call shaded fuel breaks, where they thin vegetation. They don't completely clear it, but they thin it, whether it's a forest or shrublands, next to roads and next to communities. But the problem with that is that they don't really do any good during wind-driven fires, and the key example of that is Paradise and the Camp Fire. Paradise was virtually surrounded by fuel breaks. The town was very aware that they were in a high fire zone, and they had gotten millions of dollars worth of grants over the years, and they had created fuel breaks all around the edge, and what the campfire did, which was driven by very high winds, and this is typical of all the wind-driven fires. It just blows the firebrands, which are pieces of burning wood, burning timber, and the embers just blows them right over the fire breaks, and we'll start houses. It's very rare that a community burn or houses burn because of an advancing flame front. It's embers that are carried by these winds that can gust up to 70, 80, 90 miles an hour or even higher. I mean, if you look at the Northern California fires, which burned, which were very severe in the Napa, et cetera, these were, they jumped freeways, they jumped 8-lane freeways, they jumped rivers. So this notion that if you clear a strip of vegetation, you will save your community and you save your home. It might work in a fire, a relatively tame fire that's not driven by wind. It's not going to work in the kinds of fires that we experience virtually every year and that Malibu experiences over and over and over again. So what does work? What can people do?
Well, one thing I might just point out about this Paradise disaster that happened is if you go into the town of Paradise and you see what has burned in that community, there's a big difference between what burns in a wind-driven fire versus a fuel-driven fire, which we typically see in forests in the Sierras. Many of the trees throughout the community of Paradise were still green after the fire. The embers that were blown through the forest landed on houses, and houses are extremely flammable because houses represent dead fuel. And that dead fuel of the houses was at equilibrium with the ambient relative humidity, which was below 10%. So they were extremely flammable. The trees, they had access to underground water. So many of them are still green. In fact, there's some interesting photographs showing communities in Paradise where most all the houses in the community were burned to the ground, and they're surrounded by green forest. And so it's an important lesson about the role of these embers and the not only the inadequacy of clearance, but there's actually reason to believe that clearance under those conditions can be detrimental. Because if you clear an area, and I saw many homes in Paradise that had great clearance all around them, and they burned to the ground, one of the problems with clearance is it increases the laminar flow of the ember load coming through the landscape. And so you increase the amount of embers hitting homes. And there is some discussion in a number of people, with a number of people I've had, about the role that green trees may actually have in protecting homes, what we call ember catchers. And in an article that I wrote recently, there's a photograph of a home, and this gentleman, his home didn't burn, and all the homes around him burned, but you can't see the other homes because he has all these green cedar trees between him and the other homes. There's it's certainly possible it was serendipity because we have a sample size of 1, but there's also the possibility that those green trees acted as ember catchers, and there's a lot of reason to believe that there's some validity because embers won't ignite green trees. Embers have to land on dead fuel to ignite. So if you surround your house by green trees, that might be a solution. But at this point, that's simply a hypothesis. We don't have good evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, that is something definitely to remember, that houses are fuel. As far as a fire is concerned, it doesn't distinguish. And I think I remember reading, recently in a study that the average per, square foot or square inch, whatever it was, of a house has something like twice as much fuel in it, flammable fuel, than a forest does. And that situation that you described in Paradise, basically just piles of ashes where houses once were, surrounded by green trees, is actually not unusual. It's very, very typical, again and again, in these big destructive fires that we've seen in the past couple of decades, because what happens is that the houses are not catching fire from a flame front, they're catching fire from an ember. One house will go up in flames, and then the radiant heat from that fire actually causes the other houses to ignite. And so the houses are catching, causing the other houses to ignite. And that sort of accentuates the need for home hardening, which is getting more and more attention of not just making sure that you have a good roof, but that you enclose your eaves, that you have vents. Attic vents are a classic way that embers get in, and they just smolder there, and then they can erupt when no firefighter or nobody's around. When I interviewed someone in Paradise, he was talking about there was a family that had done everything they were supposed to do in terms of defensible space. That their yard was neat and clean, and they had cut back and had the right kind of eaves, etc. But they had not put in an ember-resistant vent in their attic vent, and they were actually watching their house as embers went into their vent, and the house caught fire. And another thing, you've done research with Alexander Seipert, I mispronounced your last name, I believe, about sort of the layout of fires and the layout of houses, and how it's not just the materials of the house and how you harden the house against ember, but actually how the houses are laid out geographically that can be more conducive to ignition or not. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'll broaden it a little bit, because what we've focused on is trying to come up with a solution that describes a Southern California environment with these wind-driven fires. And what we have suggested is we need to think of 5 things, which we call the 5 Ps. And number 1 is it's a people problem. It's not a fuel problem. It's where people live that's the problem. And it's a prevention problem. We need to move away from thinking about treating fuels. And right now, there's a lot of interest coming out of Sacramento in doing fuel treatments down here. And we know very clearly this isn't going to solve our fire problem. And there's been a lot of the environmental community in Southern California has been fighting this with CAL FIRE, and finally they gave up and a couple weeks ago filed a lawsuit against CAL FIRE to stop them from doing fuel treatments. I have no idea where that will go, but it does indicate that there's a frustration in this part of the world that there's too much focus on fuels and not enough focus by CAL FIRE on the number 1 issue, which is prevention. We need to figure out how to prevent people from igniting a fire during an extreme wind event. And in particular, we need to solve this problem with power line failures. And as I pointed out in that one slide, in the last decade, most of our big fires have been power line failure fires. And right now, we have captured the attention of the power companies. They have started to respond. San Diego Gas and Electric was faced with a number of lawsuits back around 2003, on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars of lawsuits. And they started a program to deal with fire issues from power lines. Although I met with them a couple weeks ago, and they're adamant it had nothing to do with the lawsuits. It was their civic responsibility to deal with these issues. But they have greatly enhanced their maintenance program. And there are some people that contend that that is the reason why power lines have been failing, is because they've not been adequately maintained. And the Camp Fire, which burned Paradise, is a good example. The power line that was blown down that ignited that fire had already been pegged 25 years as being 25 years out of date and needed to be replaced. And they just simply did it, and there's lots of reports of how maintenance has been postponed in a lot of cases. And so now they're trying to get on board to do what San Diego Gas and Electric did, and that is to increase their maintenance procedure, as well as do this, what they call the PSPS program, Public Safety Power Shutdown Program, where the idea is, okay, if our power lines are starting a fire, then what we need to do is shut the power off in that part of the electrical grid where the winds are blowing. And it's very controversial, and it's questionable whether it solves the problem. However, San Diego Gas and Electric has been doing it on a limited scale for 10 years now. And it could be coincidence, but they haven't had any big power line fires in the last 10 years. So it might be an illustration of success. The one thing I can say about the public safety power shutdown is it captures the attention of a whole lot more citizens than the fires themselves. When you shut off the power to 300,000 people, that is a lot more people who are paying attention to fire issues than if you think of just the people who are directly affected by the fires. So prevention is planning though is another big issue. We need to think seriously about how we plan communities, and we have not historically done that. In the past, we have given a lot of credibility to flood hazards, to earthquake hazards. We've zoned areas against building in those areas due to floods and earthquakes. We haven't done the same with fire. And we need to start thinking about fire zoning and how to plan communities. But this isn't simple. If you're adding 300,000 people to the state every year, how do you zone areas to keep people from being put at risk? Because you've got to put them somewhere. And frankly, I think until we address the rate at which populations are growing in California, I think we're going to be faced with a difficult task of trying to plan safe areas for people to live.
So just to continue a little bit about the power shutdowns, which were, there were extensive power shutdowns last fall in Northern California, and that affected, I think at one of them more than 1 million people, and they were quite controversial, and the whole question became, well, do they really do any good? Does it make any difference? Well, if you look at last year's fire season, so at the beginning of, a year ago, Cal Fire predicts that every year is going to be a wildfire season. It doesn't matter if it rains and there's a lot of grass, then there's a lot of fuel, we're going to have a bad wildfire season. If it doesn't rain, well, we're going to have a lot of bad wildfire because it's dry, the vegetation is dry. It doesn't matter. There's always a prediction of a bad wildfire season. But we don't always have a bad wildfire season, and we actually didn't have one last year, despite all the attention on fire. And there were all the conditions for a very bad, fall fire season. There were late rains. October was one of the driest on record in many parts of California. But in contrast to 2018, which was the worst wildfire year in the modern record, when 1.8 million acres burned in California, and we had, incredible whole loss and mortalities. Last year, fewer than 300,000 acres burned, despite the fact that you had, these conditions that were ripe for a lot of bad wildfires. And it's arguable that a part of that reason for a much milder season was the fact that you had these big power shutdowns in Northern California, so you didn't have fires that were started by power line failures during high wind events. And so I think, I talked to you about this, John, last year, and you said, well, it's too soon to say, how effective they were, but it's indisputable that you had conditions for a very, very bad fire year, but we didn't have a very, very bad fire year. And it was coincident with extensive power shutdowns during these higher wind events. So, getting back to, you've done research that have shown that from John's research is, he looked at fire data for the past 100 years of fire data, and from Sonoma County to San Diego County, basically to the Mexican border, almost all of the wildfires are human caused, people or equipment, Arson is just, is one role. I mean, it's power lines, it's somebody using a weed whacker, it's somebody, driving a trailer, with a flat tire on a rim, a ranch hand, welding a pipe. During, it's this combination of having an ignition during high wind events. So it's not just ignitions, it's when they occur that becomes the recipe for catastrophe. And how do you address that, I think, is an issue that the state is slow to face. I mean, other parts of the West, Oregon, for instance, has much stricter regulations that they can put in place during severe fire weather on equipment use in wildlands. I mean, they can actually say, no, you cannot use a chainsaw, from like 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a really hot, fire weather day. And in New Mexico and Arizona, the National Forest Service is much more likely to completely close public access to national forests during severe fire weather. Their fire season is different than ours because they're subject to monsoons, so it tends to peak earlier in the year than in the summer than in Southern California, and they will routinely close public access to most of their national forests to prevent human-caused wildfire, because they've had some very bad wildfires in the past that were caused by escaped campfires. They were completely legal. The campfires were legal. So, California has very much focused on, sort of fuel reduction as a way of dealing with the wildfire threat that will never go away. We live in one of the most flammable landscapes in the entire world. And as we pave over the entire state, that's not going to change. And you get rid of the forest, you get rid of the chaparral, it gets replaced by invasive grasses, which are dead and easily ignitable for most of the year. So somehow the conversation has to change about how we deal with this, because what we've been doing hasn't exactly worked. And then
Let me just add one thing to that, and that is, I think that at the present time, we don't really know if the PSPS program is what accounts for limited burning in 2019. It's a research question that we're working on right now. But the thing to keep in mind is there's a huge amount of serendipity in these fires. We get Santa Ana winds every autumn. We maybe get 40 days of Santa Ana winds every year. Only 5% of them ever result in a fire. And the reason 5% result in a fire is because somebody, either intentionally or accidentally, ignited a fire during that wind event. That tells us that there's just a small number of events that are causing most of the damage, and if we can focus attention on prevention from the small number of ignitions, that is one potential way we might be able to solve the extent of burning we're seeing in the state.
So I think it's time for questions. Anthony, do you want to? Because I can barely see.
I have one. I have a question. We don't, but if you could just repeat the question, that'd be great. Then we don't have to trace around.
I have a question. If you look at the map of the Woolsey fire, there's this oasis of green. I don't know, it's 100, 200 acres. Calamigos Branch. And I talked to the guy that has set up a system of sprinklers there. It's pretty incredible. They have lakes and big sprinklers, and he attributes that to why that didn't burn and everything else burned around it. What is your knowledge, experience? What do you think about sprinklers? That they have their own water source. They're not like pulling water off the grid or anything.
It is a solution that people have talked about in terms of hardening homes, and that is putting a sprinkler system on a roof, and that would essentially prevent the house from burning, or plays a strong role in that. There's a lot of problems with it. Number one, and they're not insurmountable problems, but there are problems. For example, with the power shutdown, You got to have your own power source to run the pump, to pump the water. There's often a shortage of water during a fire because it's being used by the firefighters. So you have to provide your own water tank. And then you have the problem that with Santa Ana winds blowing 50, 60 miles per hour, that sprinkler might be doing a good job on your neighbor's house and not on your house. So there needs to be thought given to how to engineer it to make it actually work. And then there's the whole question of, are people willing to put up $1,000, maybe $2,000 to create such a system in the rare event that their house would burn? And I think that's the big question. I think housing prices right now are just through the roof, so to speak. And I don't know how many people are willing to put in another $2,000 in the event of a fire coming. And right now in the state, it's real estate is just unable, or the vast majority of people are unable to afford a single-family dwelling. I think it's something like 30% of the Californians can afford a single-family dwelling. So the cost is got to be something that people would perhaps turn them off from doing that.
You mentioned 5 Ps that are important, but I only caught 4. People, prevention, power lines, planning.
That is only 4, yes.
So we'll call it the 4.
Prediction is the last one. The number one thing that would likely enhance our ability to deal with catastrophic losses is with better prediction of the trajectory of winds and where they're going and communicating that. For example, the campfire burned really quickly and the people of Paradise got very short warning. And that's because they weren't initially clear on where those winds were going to go. Right now, there's a lot of work being done up in Sacramento and at the Desert Research Institute on Climate, trying to come up with models to predict in real time what winds are going to do. And so that prediction is going to be part of the solution, I think, in terms of reducing losses from these fires. Are you going to call on people, or do you want me to?
Why don't you go ahead and just be sure you restate the question?
I'll just start talking. Anecdotally, it seems like a lot of times fires start by roads. Do you know what is causing fires to start by roads? Is it the same thing over and over again? Is it a variety of things such as smoking, cars,
Okay, the question has to do with ignitions along roads. And I will just add that it goes beyond just anecdotal evidence. There's good studies showing that the vast majority of fires, if you look at the Santa Monica Mountains, there's maps of the ignitions, and they follow very closely roads. And they follow roads for a number of reasons. Many fires have been started by catalytic converters. And if they pull off the road into grass, they're likely to ignite the grass. Used to be cigarette smoking was a big cause of fires along roads. That's less the case today. There are issues that are being addressed right now. Caltrans, for example, has some experimental sites where they're using K-rails along the edges of roads to prevent things like catalytic converter ignited fires from burning into the wildlands. But those are probably the 2 main ways fires are started along road. Plus, roads are easy access for arsons, and arsons are certainly an important part of our fires during windy season.
We have a new committee in town called the Urban Forest Committee in our town. And one thing we're trying to do is come up with a list of recommended trees that the city will approve in our community. And one area that we're having difficulty pinning down are people who want fire retardant green trees. And which species could you, offhand, what are 2 or 3 species that you would recommend if people like the ember catching type of trees? Do we know those kind of trees?
Well, first off, I would suggest that you contact the public information person at the Montecito Fire Department. I was in a conference not long ago, and she had a lot to say about the issues of trees. Her general feeling was the species didn't make as much difference than how you treated it. For example, eucalyptus are well known in most people's minds as being highly flammable, but they're not flammable if the lower branches are trimmed off and the debris underneath them is cleared away. Pine trees are probably pretty bad. In my mind, one of the best trees is oak trees, evergreen oaks, because they have enough moisture in their foliage that you can't get them to ignite with embers. And so oaks are probably one of the best bets. But once again, talk to this woman at Montecito Fire Department, because she was of the opinion that she didn't think there was good evidence that it mattered what tree was there as long as it was well maintained.
Well, then she should have been with me when I was fighting the Woolsey fire at my house. So I fought the fire. I wrote a book about the fire, which started with an essay in the LA Times. And Eric's very kindly holding up my book, Malibu Burning. And I witnessed eucalyptus trees catch on fire. I witnessed parts of eucalyptus tree hurtle across the air and land in neighbors' yards and catch those homes on fire. So I think the idea that if we keep a eucalyptus tree green, if we keep a pine tree green, I think that's problematic. In Northern California, perhaps, but here in Southern California, where we're in and out of drought conditions, the idea that we're going to have trees that the fire department designates as highly hazardous trees, I think that's a big problem.
So what would your recommendation be for the type of tree?
I think that's fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's definite science behind the trees catching embers, but the idea that I'm going to rely on my eucalyptus trees to do that, not only can it burn down my house, it can burn down my neighbor's house. And as I saw, and I documented in the book, when one house in a neighborhood goes, it makes much more likely that two houses are going to go. When two houses go, four houses are going to go. Four houses go, the whole neighborhood is burning down. And so anything we can do, and of course you talk about the power lines, because clearly in the last few years that has been almost entirely the cause of all of these major fires. So when we talk about brush reduction or fuel reduction, which of course mainly is brush, I want to know, so many of these fires have either started by, the utility companies not maintaining their equipment, but also trees surrounding the equipment that have grown up and have not been maintained. So now these tree branches are knocking down the lines and causing the problem. That's the thing that I cannot believe the utility companies have not done a better job, and that the state has not stepped in. And they did recently, right? They did recently, and they started to rule that now they used to trim the trees just 6 inches below the lines. Now there's a law that they have to be trimmed much more. But, I drive around, because I've been driving all around Southern California talking about this book and interviewing people. Those trees are still there. If you go home right now, you will find guaranteed on your street hedges or trees that are among the lines, right? Guaranteed. Take a picture and send it to someone, because that's the start of the next fire.
If I could just say a couple of things there. Two things. When you have winds that are blowing 60 or 70 miles an hour, it doesn't matter if you clear, 50 feet from the power lines or whatever. You can still have a small branch or something, being blown, carried a long distance and getting entangled in these lines. And if you look at the last fall, when the power shutdowns began, the state required filings from PG&E and PG&E did post-shutdown inspections. And it's really illuminating when you look at those reports. And they had photographs of all of these, fallen tree branches, or just, a small, relatively small, branch and entangled in a line of, it doesn't take a big branch, to cause a failure or to cause a potential arcing, of the power lines, which is, what starts. And even if you completely clear all the way around, if you have an arcing power line and you have a bed of flammable dead grass below, which is going to be there because we don't pave, the transmission lines, we don't pave, put concrete under all the power lines running through wildlands, that can start a fire. The area that was burned, so, it's an old transmission line that, arced or snapped, in the beginning of the Paradise Fire under these high winds that come out of what's called the Jarbo Gap. That burned, very, very quickly through an area that had burned just 10 years before, had been salvaged, logged, had been cleared. It did not burn through, dense woodlands. So you have to remember the context in which these, power line failures occur. It's these very, very high winds. So, I'm not saying that clearance isn't important, but I am suggesting that even if you make sure that there is nothing there, all the trees and branches are cleared within, a fairly significant distance. That's not going to stop something from being blown by an 80-mile-an-hour wind, and it's not going to stop the grass from igniting.
Right. No, I'm very well aware of that, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is increase our odds. It's the same thing with hardening your home, right? By getting ember-resistant vents, which is a really simple and inexpensive thing to do. I mean, I found, so many times the home burned from the inside out, right? So we're talking about increasing our odds. So, there's simple things homeowners can do. I was on KNX. I wrote a contract for Fire Sanity, where there are simple things we can do, and you're just increasing your odds that your home is going to survive. And that's what I'm talking about with utility companies maintaining the foliage and trees around their power lines. It's just increasing it's increasing the chances that we're not going to have one of those events.
Over here, John. Two-part question, but both really quick. First of all, I live in Northern California. The response of a lot of our friends and neighbors to the power shutoffs are get a gasoline-powered generator for next year. I'm concerned that's going to be a worse problem. Wondering if you can comment on that. And then secondly, fire in the Southern California chaparral. Could you comment a little bit on the impact on wildlife, not just the plant landscape, but wildlife?
Okay, there were two questions. Let me just start with the first one, having to do with the likelihood that if you shut the power off, people are going to go out and buy gas-powered generators. And I've said this many times in audiences that I remember the Y2K problem, and when people were afraid the electric grid was going down, they all went out and bought gas-powered generators. I know my mother-in-law bought me one because she was concerned we would be without electricity. So that is, a real concern. Now, from the power company's point of view, it's less of an issue because their shareholders aren't going to be responsible for those fires. But it does create an additional source when you do that. I think we have a long way to go to figure out how this public safety power shutdown program should work. And it's really something that I think San Diego Gas and Electric has a lot to add to at this point because they've done a lot of work on it in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, PG&E didn't, and there are a lot of people. You were saying you were amazed that the problems existed that PG&E has created. Well, I've read a number of accounts of judges who are equally amazed, and so there are a lot of people that are very upset at the inaction that PG&E has taken in doing all this. The other question had to do with what about wildlife in chaparral and how do they respond to fire? And I used to give talks all the time about how chaparral burns and everything comes back just fine. It's not a problem. And then somebody asked me one time, what about the wildlife? And I realized I never even thought about the wildlife. So we put together a synthesis paper a few years ago on trying to evaluate what happens to the wildlife. And it depends on who you are out there. If you're a small rodent, your best bet is going underground and trying to survive the fire that way. But it all depends on the type of fire. If you have a Santa Ana wind-driven fire, going underground can work just fine because the fire passes so quickly that you don't have to worry about losing the oxygen in your tunnel. Slow burning ones can be a problem in that regard. But you have larger wildlife or birds, and their approach is not to try and what I call shelter in place, which is what rodents do, but rather flee and then recolonize. The recolonizing strategy is something that is more and more problematical in our landscape because recolonizing requires there be metapopulations, in other words, populations away from the burn that they can survive in until they have a chance to recolonize. in a highly fragmented landscape like Southern California, there are fewer and fewer metapopulations out there available for species to shelter in between the fires. And so for deer and a lot of birds, it can be problematical if you already have a landscape that's highly fragmented due to development.
A follow-up to the power line shutoffs post shutoff. When they went back and looked, did they actually see damaged lines that would have caused the fire?
They saw literally hundreds of instances of damaged lines and instances where the damage would, they believe, was capable of causing, had the power been on, would have caused arcing, which, you know, can very much ignite a fire.
And then one other thing, what I understand is San Diego, they actually divided the main lines into smaller segments that could be, they could tailor better where to cut off power. Whereas Northern California,
Right. I mean,
they had the ability, they had to cut off millions of people.
yeah, I mean, the San Diego system is much smaller and is more segmented, and so they have done a very good job of being able to restrict the. So instead of cutting off power to hundreds of thousand people, they can cut off power to like 10,000 people because their system is much more segmented and is not, is not so intensely connected. And that is something that is going to take a lot of effort and money on the part of PG&E to replicate in Northern California, and which is one of the reasons why they have said that it's going to take 10 years. These massive power shutdowns are going to go on for years because they don't have the capability of looking at their, the weather forecast, the wind forecast, and saying, okay, it's this particular spot that we think is really going to get, high winds, and we can just shut down the wind around, this peak or in this particular pass, and we don't have to shut down the power everywhere else. They don't have that technological capability, and it's going to take investments and changing their distribution system to do that. It's not just a matter of building putting up stronger transmission lines or new power lines. It's a matter of segmenting their distribution system so that they can coordinate these shutdowns in a much more sophisticated manner, which is what San Diego does. And I mean, the San Diego system is fascinating. I mean, they hired, and PG&E is beginning to do this now. I mean, they hired full-time meteorologists, and when wind events are coming up, they're on call 24 hours a day, and they're monitoring everything, and they're saying, okay, we think that the wind's going to be here, and then they they have this instantaneous, reaction of, okay, we're going to shut down power here, and then, okay, we can reactivate it there. So it's a very sophisticated system.
Yeah, what San Diego Gas and Electric has done, they put up weather stations on over 200 of their poles throughout San Diego County, and they're monitoring in real time what the weather is doing throughout the county. And they have a room. It's been moved now, and I don't know what it looks like now, but when I visited, they had a room about this size, and they must have had about 50 TV monitors all around the room monitoring different parts of the county, and their plan was to watch what was going on. But one of the interesting things, the most recent meeting I had with them, is they were adamant that this power shutdown program is just a temporary program. They don't plan on doing that continuously. Their plan is eventually they are going to have the lines either underground or maintained at a level where you don't have to worry about the winds igniting a fire. And so they were adamant. The power shutdown program is not a permanent program. It's something that will end once they've solved these other programs. They claim they have 60% of their distribution lines underground. And at first, I found it a little hard to believe, but I talked to somebody at the Public Utilities Commission. They said, no, that's right, but it's because there's a state law that all new developments have to have underground power, and the county's growing so quickly, there's lots and lots of underground power going in. So yeah, 60% are underground, but those aren't the ones most vulnerable to being blown down by the winds.
book, and he's got some with him. I got it 6 months ago, and really it's an amazing book. The next thing is that last year we had a fire, the Getty fire, not too far from the Getty, and it was a power pole problem. And the thought that, you know, we've always known that the best neighborhoods will have the power underground. Why we can't turn to them and say, listen, all your power has to go underground. And also, they don't like the idea that people will go off the grid, that they'll have their own solar power, whatever, wind power, whatever. They don't like that idea because that's their business and they're a monopoly. The future of demanding if you're going to have the power, it's underground, and that there's encourage people to go off the grid.
Yeah, the whole issue of, you know, how to deal with this in terms of the utility companies, the long-range solution is solar power. If we were to expand solar power usage, we potentially could greatly reduce the threat from the electric grid. In terms of getting utility companies to put in underground power, that's a hard one to sell. I've had many discussions with utility companies, and they claim, first off, it's way too expensive to do, and it's also impossible to do under some landscapes, and it has negative environmental impacts because some sensitive habitats can't be disturbed with underground power. So they're very much against it, but like San Diego Gas and Electric claims, they put 60% of their distribution lines underground, but those are all distributed around communities that are new developments.
Yeah, I think the power failure that caused the Getty fire, I mean, that was DWP, LA DWP, and they don't do shutoffs. And as we can all see from probably millions of miles of power lines that run throughout the LA basin, I don't think they're going to be undergrounded in any time in any of our lifetimes.
Well, the one thing you have to keep in mind is you can do everything right and your home can still burn. So there's no certain solution to these things. I have seen examples like the big fire in Carlsbad several years ago. There's a home there that you'll be able to see a picture of it because it's coming out in a new edition of Fremontia, the journal Fremontia, which is having an issue just on fires. And there's a picture in one of the articles that Alex Seifert and I have written of a home that had great clearance all around it. In fact, it had a 30-foot wall above the vegetation, wildland vegetation, and the yard was covered with ice plant. And so you couldn't have protected the landscape better than that, and the house burned.
Ice plant burns.
Yeah, well, the house definitely burned. And when it comes to these embers, it's not the fire front. I think Bettina alluded to this earlier. It's not the fire front that burns up the mountain and burns the house down. It's the embers that blow across the landscape.
I know we said this would be it. Can you guys take two more because we're going on 90 minutes with this program. I've got two more questions here and then we'll wrap up. So please.
We're talking about solar power. Many of the homes have solar panels on their roofs. Has there been any research done in fire prevention or catching ambers? Is there any effect of the solar panels, good or bad, on the fire prevention or causing fires on the other side of the scale?
I don't know of any research. Do you know of any research?
No, it's a fantastic question, and I have thought about doing an article on just that, which is, you know, you put solar panels on the roof, is an ember going to land on the solar panel and catch your house on fire?
Or vice versa, does the solar panel reject the ember and protect your roof?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I think that it's feasible that it could actually play a protective role. But once again, the real problem is, as was mentioned earlier, the house often burns from the inside out because the embers get through the vents, and it depends a lot on, you know, whether you have closed. One of the things that about closed eaves is the vents are not facing the wind direction. If you have open eaves, the vents are basically perpendicular to the ground. If you have closed eaves, the vents are parallel to the ground. So just closing the eaves could greatly decrease the chance of embers getting in. Yeah, the issue that she raises has to do with urban fuels. And it's an interesting one because there are many communities, not just in Southern California, but in the Bay Area as well, where the urban fuels from things that are growing in people's yards are way worse than the wildland fuels. The problem is the state agency that is largely concerned with fuel treatments doesn't have the ability to go in and tell communities what they should be doing in their urban plantings. And so it's really a matter of jurisdiction. CAL FIRE doesn't have any control over it, but there is no question. There are lots of communities where the urban fuels from things like acacias and pines and eucalyptus are far worse than the wildland fuels, and yet we have tons of money going into wildland fuel manipulation. And there are efforts to try and get money to go into urban projects through fire safe councils and that sort of thing. But there are programs to bring money to communities to do that sort of treatment within the communities.
This kind of builds. I get the last question because I'm the. I think she's addressing the same issue I was thinking about. Is that is as we get more concretized, especially in Southern California. You guys mentioned there will be less and less sort of indigenous, native fuel that will be burning, just like what we're talking about. What is a brush fire, or what is a fire going to look like in Southern California in 50 years?
I don't think we're going to have any. We won't have anything left to burn. It's hard to predict what it's going to be like when we're adding 300,000 people a year, and you multiply that by 50, that's a lot more people. In 50 years, we're going to have, what, we're at 40 million now. 50 years, we're likely to be probably close to double that, 80 million people. You think the freeways now are a problem. Wait. Luckily, most of us won't have to wait 50 years to find out. But the landscapes are going to be extremely different in 50 years from now. There's going to be less to burn. And my guess is we have far worse problems in 50 years than wildfires. But that's simply because my creative energy is probably shot for the night.
Well, I mean, I think I won't hazard a guess, but I mean, we aren't, going to be able to pave over everything, and those, I think we're going to have more and more hillsides that, rather than this, rich chaparral that offers habitat and is, can be so lovely to look at, we're just going to have a bunch of biologically dead grasslands, that are brown and dead. I mean, you drive. I mean, it was actually after my first field trip with Jon in 2007, and another story that I did in relation to that series. It just changed the whole way I looked at the Golden State. Most of the grasses, almost all of the grasses that we see in California are not native. The native grasses were eradicated a long time ago. They're invasive grasses. Some were intentionally introduced, some were accidentally introduced. They're annuals. They live for a couple of months in the spring. They die. They're brown. They're golden. They're dried up. And they offer, a fraction of the biological value and arguably aesthetic value of our native wildlands. So that, unfortunately, I think is what we're, very few of us are going to be alive in 50 years. I know I'm not going to be, but certainly in more and more in places like Southern California, I think that's what we're going to be looking at.
I would just add, if you want to see what Bettina's talking about, go to the big island of Hawaii, stand on the Kona coast, and as far as you can see, you don't see any native plants. It's all been completely extirpated.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, and thank you one more time. Let's give them a big round of applause. Both doing this as volunteers for our organization tonight. So we're very, very grateful. And please join us and help us and all that kind of stuff. Thank you.